So thanks for your patience here. We're going to get going with today's lecture. Today's lecture is going to be on particle filtering. It's going to be one of 3 lectures that I'm planning to deliver in the next several weeks on the topic of this very important and exciting methodology. Today's discussion of particle filtering will be a somewhat more introductory one, one that seeks to build some intuition, some motivations for particle filtering, but goes enough into the how to give some flavor for how this method works and why it works. Some of the, well, I know some of you here, in fact, both of you here in the front row have previously worked with particle filtering. It's taken me a couple of years to develop certain intuitions for it, but also certain appreciation for its power, its significance. And I hope that while you may be familiar with some of the details of how it's conducted, this may give you an appreciation for the fundamental place I believe it merits within the techniques we use in dynamic modeling. So within the talk, I'm first going to talk some about motivations and intuitions for particle filtering. Why a technique like this is needed from 2 different perspectives. One are perspectives of a technique for knitting together diverse sets of data that present different faces of an underlying system, an underlying dynamic system, and to knit those together into a coherent picture of the whole system. So that's one motivation. A second motivation for it is as a technique for avoiding having models, dynamic models over time, diverge from the reality of the situation in the external world. When we are characterizing systems in the external world, particularly systems that have stochastics or a lot of uncertainties associated with them, or where even the dynamics is uncertain, it's very common for our models, once built, to grow increasingly disconnected from the reality of what's going on. They start to undergo bit rot. They start to become outdated. And a key use of particle filtering that contrasts with other sort of cognate techniques like calibration is the fact that as we calibrate, or excuse me, as we engage in particle filtering with a dynamic model, we are on a continual basis regrounding that model in the state of the world. We are updating its state, not merely its estimate of its parameter values, to reflect an understanding of what's going on in the world now. And it's this ability to keep a model current with the current situation in the world that allows us to then look forward with greater confidence. It allows us to evaluate interventions. So we're going to be talking about these motivations and intuitions in the first part of this, and I'm going to be giving a few examples to ground them. We're then going to go into some sort of high-level glimpses of particle filtering, including some contributions contributed from some in the room. And then we're going to talk about some of how it works. I'll then speak very briefly about evaluation and particle filtering and some points of learning before concluding with some remarks. This talk will serve as a useful foundation for my next talk, which will really get into the nitty-gritty of how particle filtering works. So if you wish to perform particle filtering and you really want to grok deeply, how does this work? Why does it work? Why is it we carry these particles around with these weights associated with them? Why is it that the weight is updated in a certain fashion when we see an observation? in what sense are the particles elements of a distribution? If you want to understand that, we're going to have more for you in my next talk. Okay? A third talk will also focus on how we carry it, how we implement particle filtering within a dynamic model using subscripting, which is again things that that you two here will be familiar with. Okay, so in terms of motivation and intuition, there's two reflections and associated needs that I find helpful to think about in the context of particle filtering. So pardon me for just a second. I just realized that people all over the world can see what's on my screen, but somehow no one in the room can see what's on it. So we're just going to remedy that. There we go. Okay. Within this context, there's two motivations that I find particularly compelling for understanding the need for particle filtering and where it fits in. The first of them is a reflection more generally on the need for insight involving complex systems, such as the systems we work with in the health and healthcare area. And the motivation or the reflection here is, look, often we're seeking to grapple with, we're seeking to understand how to best manage or how to best intervene in a complex external situation. Maybe it's recurrent small outbreaks for measles in Alberta, or maybe it's challenges associated with shingles and chicken pox within the same context, or maybe it's challenges of diabetes type 2 and gestational diabetes in the Australian Capital Territories. When we're dealing with these situations where we have a complex situation out there in the world, we often have multiple lines of quantitative evidence, of evidence that may be over time, often they are, otherwise data points, that relate to different parts of the same underlying system. So we have this underlying system, and we see different faces of it, or different facets of it, different glimpses of it in different data that we have. And often the data that we receive from about these different components are different levels of reliability or different levels of frequency with which they're collected. And we're interested here in having a consistent picture of what's going on out there in the world, of knitting those together into some shared understanding of what's going on. It's as if we have pieces of where the blind man and the elephant. Each of us feels a different part of this elephant. Some feel the trunk, some feel a leg, others the tail, others an ear, and we're trying to put all these pieces together to get an understanding of the whole elephant that's giving rise to this data. And we're particularly interested in the health and having an understanding of the current count of people at different degrees of risk out there in the population. So we see different facets of the system, different pieces of the elephant. We're interested in understanding the whole. Often our motivations for doing that are because we're then interested in looking at the evolution of the current situation over time and evaluating trade-offs involving it as well. An example of this is H1N1 influenza, where we might have at any one time daily incident case counts for lab diagnosed H1N1, and on the other hand, emergency department ILI admissions just based on symptoms, influenza-like illness symptoms, people admitted to EDs because of it, many of which may be H1N1, but not all. We might have further incident case counts of the above by age group on a less frequent basis. In some cases, we might have daily. In some cases, for the aggregate or for the broken down data by age group, we might have monthly, for example, data. We might have other data regarding the system that's of lower quality, but surely tells us something about what's going on. We might have, for example, influenza-related searches on Google or we might have mentions of influenza within our jurisdiction of interest via Twitter, such as I routinely look at for our Twitter archives for here in Saskatchewan, and Li Xiaoyan has been accumulating for Alberta, for example. Alternative, we may have things like monthly delivered cases of H1N1. None of these is the same as the other. None of these duplicates the other or merely is a more detailed version of the other. Rather, each of these is a facet of the underlying system. They relate to the same underlying system. They're not totally independent of each other. Or for example, gestational and type 2 diabetes, such as we're working with the Australian Capital Territories, and we've done long work here in Saskatchewan, we might have annual incidence case counts for diagnosed gestational diabetes and type 2 diabetes. We might even have information related to pre-diabetic diagnoses. We might also have annual births of large infants, of macrosomic infants, total births, and cross-sectional weight profiles for the population that characterize the population's weight over time for subsamples of the population on an occasional basis. Or for suicide, right, we might have monthly incident case counts of completed suicides, and through our municipal partners like the Saskatchewan Police Service, we might have suicide attempts information, some count of those on a monthly basis. But we might also have suicide-related searches or potentially suicide-related searches on Google for our jurisdiction, Twitter mentions of suicide that are somewhat serious from our region, and helpline calls. All of these, again, are different facets of an underlying system. And here we're interested in, if possible, knitting them together into a consistent picture of the whole system. In other contexts, such as CAT scans and MRI scans and medical imaging, we have ways of taking diverse pieces of evidence. They are sort of slices, images of slices through the body, or particular cross sections or surfaces within the body. And out of a given CAT scan or MRI, we might get dozens or hundreds of these images. And we have ways of putting them together to give a 3D portrait of the body being imaged. This is how MRI and CAT scan work, and there's some fascinating mathematics behind it with the Redon transform, etc. What we'd like here for dynamic models, or for the context of these diverse data sources over time, is a way of constructing a sort of equivalent picture of the whole from these many parts, where just as with the CAT scan and MRI cases, each of the pieces, each of the images we get out of a CAT scan or MRI initially is very imperfect. It suffers from occlusion. Part of it has been blocked from a given angle. If you're sending X-rays through the body, bones will occlude some tissues and so on. So a given image coming out of CAT scan along the way might have lots of occlusion in it. It has limited coverage. It only shows certain parts of the body. But you knit them all together with this underlying mathematics, and you get a 3D picture of what's going on. And what we're seeking within our context is a way of getting that picture of the system as a whole. Now, a key technology for that, as those here will appreciate, is that we can make use of a dynamic model. A dynamic model in many ways depicts the underlying system as a whole. The underlying system as it's composed of many interlinked pieces. A model like that is very useful for projecting forward, for understanding the current situation, evaluating trade-offs. If we could inform such a model with these multiple lines of evidence, if we could take these multiple pieces of evidence that we have, that we talked earlier about, like here, for each of these examples, if we had some way of knitting these together to give a picture within a model of the current situation, In many ways, that will be like constructing that 3D image using CAT scan data or MRI data, because the model depicts the system as a whole. It depicts kind of the current situation of the system and allows us to project it forward. So to some degree, particle filtering, when it's conducted with many types of inputs simultaneously, can be analogized to something like what we do in imaging, putting together multiple pieces, multiple lines of evidence into a piece, into a dynamic model. When we apply to dynamic modeling, part of there's many other applications as well. So let's think about dynamic models. The challenge here is that with dynamic models, we typically work in a way that doesn't traditionally allow this. We build the model, we calibrate it, we formulate it, we parameterize it, and then we kind of have a break with the evidence in the sense that we stop incorporating evidence, we stop the building, and we start using it. We use it for insights of various sorts. And we can go back and take that model at a later time and reparameterize it, recalibrate it, and so on. But it's a fairly heavyweight process. It takes quite a bit of manual time to update the model with new data, to update it with new evidence, to sort of incorporate an understanding of what's going on. One of the ways we do this traditionally is through this process called calibration. And I'm not going to go into details of calibration here, but calibration at its crux involves adjusting model parameter assumptions so that the model's output, the model's emergent behavior, best matches the observed data from the population or the observed data from the world. And calibration is very powerful for doing that. And as you folks know, we use it a lot in our methods. The problem is that it has real limitations, and many of them are methodological limitations that are very serious. For example, in many calibration instances, we get a point estimate, particular values of the parameter that are single most likely. Even if we have error bars around it, we can't take those error bars and translate them into error bars around model output going forward, it turns out. You can't, because of the methods involved, you can't just translate it directly into that because of the non-linearities involved. It is something where we lack often an explicit probabilistic model for the process error and measurement error being assumed in calibration. But perhaps most critically, ladies and gentlemen, even if we calibrate a model over time as new data comes in on an occasional basis, calibration is updating estimates of parameters, not estimates of the underlying model state over time. It's not updating an estimate of what the current situation is so much as what the values of the parameters are. And what that means is the current model state, the situation right now in the model, becomes increasingly disconnected from the world. So this is one motivation. We'd like to have this way of knitting together these multiple lines of evidence into a consistent portrait of the system as a whole. And our tool for doing that, for depicting the system as a whole, is a dynamic model. But calibration in this traditional process of building a model and then only later, only occasionally and through a manual process updating it, just is not well suited to bringing in new data over time and knitting it together to a picture of what's going on now. Calibration gives us an updated estimate of the recalibration gives us an updated estimate of the parameters, but not of the underlying model state. Okay, a second motivation here. So that's one motivation, knitting together multiple lines of evidence to give us a picture of what's going on right now. A second big motivation has a somewhat different motivation, somewhat different particulars, and it's about taking evidence as it comes in and using it to reground a model's estimate. And the exemplar context I'd like to use to this to kind of motivate is is not privileged, but I think it's compelling, and it's a case of outbreak response, such as both you two have worked with. The type of outbreak response we might have to childhood infectious diseases or to influenza, particularly new strains, etc. And the observation here is, look, when we have a need to respond to an outbreak, we have a lot of concerns about how that outbreak will update. But in many contexts, more than that, ladies and gentlemen, we have uncertainties associated with the situation. One of the biggest uncertainties relates to what the current situation is out there in the world. We only see a glimpse of it. We see some rising number of cases, and we wonder how many people out there are actually sick. But we're also interested in clarity on what lies forward. Is this going to grow rapidly? Do we have time to mobilize resources on a more gradual basis to engage in vaccination? Do we need to make a full court press over the next week, and otherwise the situation is lost, etc.? We're interested in anticipating the trajectory of cases going forward in an emerging outbreak on an ongoing basis. And I personally have been approached by health policymakers in the midst of outbreaks asking for help with this. They want to know, are we going to see a rapid rise? Is it going to plateau soon? Are we going to see a rise and fall, and then another rise and fall like we did in some previous outbreaks? They want some guidance as to how it's likely to evolve. And we have many partners for our group here in the province, in other provinces, and Public Health Agency of Canada, and partners, in fact, worldwide, who have interests in this. Now, part of what makes this challenging for us as modelers, even with these very powerful tools of dynamic models, is that for outbreaks, and particularly for outbreaks of new conditions, of new diseases, think SARS, the sudden acute respiratory syndrome that crested in the early 2000s. Think MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. Think Legionnaire's disease, or think H1N1 influenza. These are emerging outbreaks. Even Ebola in its recent manifestations. And often for these type of situations, there's little empirical data to go with at first, or there's little knowledge of the underlying pathogen, and little opportunity to craft a really highly grounded empirical model. If we want to influence planning for this, if we want to influence policymakers with a model, we don't have the luxury of taking a year to build the model. We don't have the luxury of going and waiting until the latest evidence is available, or really solid evidence is available on things like the latent period, the incubation period, things like the mean time of infectiousness, or time until waning of immunity. And yet, absent grounded in some sort of empirical evidence, the accuracy of projections and policy trade-offs, the trade-offs for immunizing this group, pregnant women versus healthcare workers versus children in schools, the impact of closing schools versus mass immunization campaign or outbreak response immunization, etc. It's not clear if we don't have good evidence. But at the same time, by the time a highly precise model can be put together of the sort that, for example, Wade, you've looked at with chickenpox, often the greatest chance to shape policy in response to an outbreak has been lost. And this puts us in a difficult quandary, because we either need to plan based on a really inaccurate model that grows increasingly disconnected from the world as time passes on. We build it, we calibrate it, it's a nice shiny new model, but then as weeks pass, it grows increasingly disconnected from what's going on in the world. It doesn't have an indication of how many people out there now are sick. Or we can wait for a highly detailed model that isn't available in time for planning. Now, the reflection here is further that, look, even if you have the most detailed model, the most rich, rigorous model built on extremely high quality data, and even if it's a very, very well thought through model, eventually it's going to diverge from the empirical situations. Models by nature are simplifications of the world. Like maps, they are useful because they simplify features of the world, and boil it down to a smaller set of simpler factors. That's what allows us to run them, to build them in reasonable time, etc. But as such, they often omit factors, or they include approximations such as random mixing involving the population. Even if we're dealing, as we do with so many projects, with individual-based models, where we have networks depicted on a per-person basis and mobility patterns, those are themselves approximations. And the predictions we get from those approximations will, over time, diverge from situation in the world. Also, things out there in the world are influenced by factors that are left out of the model. And critically, and I don't know why it's not on this list, are important components that are stochastic in nature. Perhaps I was including it in terms of exogenous influences. But here, we often will have things that are effectively stochastic out there in the world that we can't be asked to predict. I mean, aspects of the weather situation over long periods of time, for example. And we could have the most reasonable model in the world, but it's not going to be able to predict which way certain stochastics will go. Not even, it's not going to be able to anticipate which way a stochastic process will change. There's also misestimates, latent heterogeneity, etc. Lots of things that even in the best of models lead it to eventually diverge from observations in the world. But somehow, ladies and gentlemen, somehow, when we navigate the world, there's a way we do it that's robust to this in our daily occurrences, right? Look, all of us have mental models that you had to use, you had to exercise to even get here for this presentation this morning, and you're going to use to get home after the presentation. And most of us enjoy highly refined models of how to get from here to home. Very good models of the way home. But despite the refined nature of these models, despite having a very acute sense of how many steps there are in that staircase we travel, the location of that sidewalk we cross, the sense of the width of the road, of the turns of the corridors, none of us would even dream of trying to navigate to home without input along the way, without some sort of glimpses along the way of where we are, right? If we tried to navigate home with our eyes shut, we'd end up in a world of hurt. We'd end up falling down staircases. We'd end up walking out into traffic when the light doesn't happen to be favorable. We'd end up tripping over curbs. We'd end up running into walls. And this reflects the fact, and I highlight these things because they're non-trivial. There's growing inaccuracy. The longer we go without a grounded input about where we are right now, the longer we go, the more and more off our sense of position will tend to be. Unless we have some input to reground us, generally we'll grow more and more disconnected from where we are. At first, I may be very clear about where I am, but as each successive step I take, I'm going to grow less sure about where I am. And both our mental models and our observations along the way, not just our models, but the ability to observe along the way is needed to get us home safely. And neither is enough on its own. So we need, ladies and gentlemen, to have those inputs along the way to guide us. You can imagine going home with opening your eyes only every 15 seconds or something. It wouldn't be nearly as safe as doing it with your eyes open altogether, but you can imagine occasionally doing it. And you could get home quite well. If you could open your eyes every 15 seconds, you'd be constantly regrounded as to your position. You'd know where you are. You'd know where you need to go from that. Even if you could open your eyes every minute, maybe it would cause you to pause occasionally, but you would be confident enough about where you are, you could get home safely. But with your eyes closed, we are asking for a world of hurt. So the question here is, from this motivation, why is it with most simulation models that they're asked to be used blind? We actually build the model, and then we try to use it to address a changing situation without updating the estimates in the model on a regular basis. We use it to try to go forward with this high quality model without any new input to that model, without regrounding the model, without updating the model. It's much less depending on our fine models in our heads to get home with our eyes closed. We're not updating our sense of where we're at now and our sense of some of these uncertainties, such as stochastics, that affect us. So, the irony here is, while we never think about relying purely on our mental model, even a very good mental model, without complementing it with observations, we do so regularly with dynamic models in many contexts. And I challenge that this is a tradition which is dangerous, and that the tools that we're going to present in this lecture are just as useful as these observations. The ability to peek out occasionally as to where we are every 30 seconds on our way home is a key need for getting home safely, and it's just as key with simulation models. So the vision here is to come up with quickly formulated, frequently regrounded dynamic models. Models that are rough and ready. They're assembled quickly, perhaps in response to something like an emerging outbreak. But they're automatically regrounded when new data becomes available to sharpen their understanding of the current situation and sharpen our understanding of values of certain changing parameters. And here we don't just rely on model predictions about where we're at based on a baseline, starting point for the model, a year ago now, and project forward to where we are now and project forward further. But we rely on empirical observations. We learn from observations. We learn in terms of our understanding of the model state and in terms of our understanding of parameter values. So here, model state is kept current with the latest evidence. And by being kept current, we can use it to project forward and anticipate intervention trade-offs with greater clarity. Okay, so those are some motivations. Let's jump now into particle filtering basics. So I mentioned this solution vision, and one of the most powerful ways of accomplishing this automatic regrounding using today's computational statistics machine learning tools is through the use of what are broadly called filtering methods. And particle filtering is an example filtering method. It allows us to take a model and it allows us to take evidence over time and bring them together to get an understanding of an updated estimate for the current model state, which can then be used to look forward. And within our group, it's not the only filtering method we've used. No, for a number of contexts, we further made use of what's known as the Kalman filter. And the Kalman filter is a powerful technique that is extraordinarily widely used, and it dates back to the 1950s with the pioneering work of Rudolf Kalman to address the same filtering need. But it does differ in several regards. And we won't go into this in detail, but suffice it to say that particle filtering provides a far more general approach, one that is not, that allows us to sample from distributions of the current state and parameter values for parameters that are changing stochastically per time. Whereas Kalman filter provides a single point estimate and covariance around it using what are called maximum likelihood estimate methods. Now, Kalman filtering can be highly effective for linear systems, but point estimates can be highly problematic when we have nonlinearity in place, okay, when we have a nonlinear system. But also reflecting its simplified character relative to particle filtering, Kalman filtering is limited by really stiff distributional assumptions. In Kalman filtering, we have to assume, to apply the techniques, very strong assumptions about the noise, the type of noise seen for both what's called measurement noise, the noise in terms of how accurately we can measure things from the world, the error associated with those measurements, but also assumptions about the noise associated with the system evolution over time. And both it assumes to be Gaussian in nature, to be characterized by normal distributions. And it does rely very heavily on linearization systems, systems that within our context in health are typically nonlinear. And it turns out that this can lead it to get off in la-la land, where it's just totally confused about what's going on from its single estimate. It's put all its eggs in the basket of a single estimate that's very far off, and it linearizes around that estimate. And it turns out that Kalman filtering is the technique of choice traditionally for many contexts which have demanded ongoing updates, like updates many times a second. Think about a plane flying, or think about a rocket, where we are constantly getting new data in, perhaps a few times a second, and we have to perform updates that balance our model of the rocket's thrust with and where it should be based on our understanding of the rocket physics with measurements from noisy GPS signals, for example. There we might need to, many times a second, do updates for our estimate, get a consensus estimate back about where we're at now, so we can plan how much thrust to put into the boosters, et cetera. And we have to do this in a very computational, frugal fashion. But meanwhile, with particle filtering, we have a much more computationally demanding system to run. We typically can't run it in for our types of models in fractions of a second. But our needs in the health space typically have many seconds at least between any new estimates come in. Think from something like Ethica, or they'll have a day between observations from an emergency room, or 15 minutes between observations of waiting times in within emergency departments. And here we have a lot more luxury of performing heavier weight methods. We don't need it multiple times a second. We can, as long as we can do it multiple times an hour, we're fine. Okay, so what is Kalman filtering? Very powerful, but very restrictive, and needlessly computational frugal for our purposes. So, in very highest terms, and this will be very basic for everyone here, particle filtering helps us sample from a sort of probabilistic, I'd like to term it a consensus distribution. It's a posterior distribution that reflects both model estimates as well as that are faulty, that are fallible, model estimates that have some strength, some meaning to them, but are limited in their accuracy, and combining that with data from the world that's noisy, that's uncertain, that also has wide distributions of error associated with it. So, for example, for H1N1, or for flu, or for chickenpox, et cetera, and even for things like gestational type 2 diabetes, the reports we get for new cases of influenza are just a small sample of the reports out there. There's lots of people who don't present for care, don't come in to emergency departments, for example, or their family doctors with flu. And we only glimpse a small part of the system. So even there, with clinically validated or lab validated data, it's very noisy because we only have a small sample of the population. So the particle filter takes these two lines of evidence, model projections on the one hand, and one or more types of empirical data, and merges them together to get a kind of consensus estimate within the model about the values of the state variables. It allows us to sample from the state variables different possible hypotheses for what's going on in there out there in the world. And more than that, in addition to distribution over model state, a particle filter could be used to allow us to sample from, and I'm trying to get this to, I think it's because this thing is engaging in painful behavior. Okay, so we can use a model like this to get distributions over trajectories or outcomes for interventions going forward. Its ability to sample this distribution of the current model state that allows us to sample a distribution of outcomes for an intervention, for example, or a distribution of possible evolutions of the model going forward. So there's many uses of a particle filter. I've listed three particularly powerful ones here. One is just to understand the distribution distributions of hypotheses involving the situation in the world. We may have empirical data and a model that collectively have some uncertainties, and we want to consciously take into account different hypotheses that are consistent with those observations in the model. And there might be quite a few that are consistent with what we see of the world. And often it is useful to be able to consciously examine those and think about what we know with greater confidence about things in the world and what we know with less confidence. A second need is to probabilistically project the evolution of the current system forward from the current point. A third need is to evaluate different interventions, to evaluate interventions as they might impact the world. So, for example, we might have a model that depicts the current state in the world, this being shown as for most of our particle filtering work, an aggregate model where we divide people up: susceptible, infected, recovered, and vaccinated. And this model depicts sort of dynamic hypotheses for how things work out there in the world. And we're interested in combining that together with empirical data concerning the number of individuals, say, who are diagnosed as infectives, recognizing that's a subset of all individuals out there. So we might have data to a certain point, and we want to use this model to project forward how the number of cases of influenza will evolve, where what's critical here is that we've only taken certain data into account, and it's giving us a distribution over the numbers of people in each of these states, a joint distribution. So we have different hypotheses. One hypothesis might posit, for example, a medium level of susceptibles, a larger level of or a significant number of exposed, comparatively few infectives, a decent number of vaccinated individuals, and recovered individuals, very few. Another hypothesis might posit more susceptibles, fewer exposed, a small number of infectives as well, small number of recovereds, and a medium level of vaccinated. These would be different hypotheses in the world that might be consistent with the empirical data we've seen thus far. But the model, the particle filtering is associated with the model with this joint distribution. So it's a joint distribution at the current time. We can use it to project forward. And as new data comes in, new evidence is accumulated, not just from these data points prior to time 20, but now prior to time 27, we can look forward with greater confidence. Yet more data comes in, we can look forward further. And once again, we are sampling from the distribution of the current situation here and using it to project forward. And as new data comes in, we can have greater and greater confidence about what's likely to play out in the next few weeks. Or this work from Cheyenne here with measles in Saskatchewan, where we might have data up to a certain point and we're uncertain looking forward. But as new data comes in over time, new data comes in over time, we can, so now we've gone from being at this point where we only have this data up till now and projecting forward probabilistically, given the joint distribution over to how many people are in different states now and values of stochastically evolving parameters. Now we go to something like this, where we have up to time 35, so that's about here, and we're projecting forward from there. Now we have up to time 44, up to about here, and we're projecting forward. And the point is, we have more and more data we're taking into account, and our understanding of the values of different model states and our understanding of different evolving parameters may be learning from this data till now to project forward accordingly. If, for example, there's been a long period where there's been few outbreaks here, where the outbreaks has been small, the model knows, okay, the number of susceptibles must be rising because it is going to favor hypotheses, it turns out, which posit a small but growing number, small initially, but growing number of individuals who are susceptible. Only those hypotheses will be very consistent with this observation of few cases. Others which posited a sudden collapse in the number of susceptibles and a big outbreak have been weeded out, have been eliminated because they're not competitive hypotheses. They've been eliminated in a survival of the fittest of different hypotheses. The ones that survived are the ones that are consistent with showing a small number of cases, and all of those involve a growing number of susceptibles during this period. There's no two ways about it. If we have few cases here, the number of susceptibles must be rising. And so the particle filter is learning from the observed data about what must be going on in the underlying system, what's going on across the different state variables. And that implies some learning in terms of the values of those variables that can then be used to project forward. So, for example, after this long period, you notice the model posits that a growth in the number of measles cases will be occurring. This reflects the fact there's a large number of susceptibles. And that comes out of the fact that because there are a large number of susceptibles, we're particularly prone to an outbreak. And so it is that this continues on. Okay, so now I'd like to talk, having motivated us, giving a bit of the glimpse here, I'd like to talk a little bit about how particle filtering works. So how does Kalman filtering work? I noted earlier that this is a technique for taking a model and data to this point and using it to project forward. And it depends on a single point estimate with covariance around it, with a covariance matrix. That's based on a maximum likelihood estimate based on a linearized model. By contrast, particle filtering has many shared components. You notice going back and forth here, these top are basically these top 2 points are basically the same. The difference is particle filtering has loose distributional assumptions, and instead of carrying around a single estimate with a covariance around it, it represents, as it were, operationally, a distribution of trajectories. It actually can sample from a distribution of possibilities about what's going on out there in the world. And crudely speaking, and we'll be refining this notion, but crudely speaking, the elements that make up this distribution are called particles. So you could think of each of them as being associated with a certain hypothesis about the world. Each particle is associated with a certain hypothesis, say, for how many people are out there in the population for our model are in this state versus this state versus this state versus this state versus the vaccinated state. So That would be one particle might posit, 973,000 people here, 5,242 here, a certain number here, et cetera. Another particle might posit, 897,000 people susceptible, 1,000 people who are exposed, et cetera. So each of those particles carries around a sort of hypothesis for the current situation in the world. And as I said earlier, as I alluded to earlier, there's a sort of survival of the fittest of particles, the ones that are consistent with the evidence to this point are rewarded and reproduced. There's more of them that come about. The ones that are inconsistent with the evidence get weeded out. They're not competitive hypotheses. They're inconsistent, for example, with recent observations of consistently low incidence cases, and those particles are likely to die out. Okay. Now, these particles are not strictly themselves samples from the entire posterior distribution, the entire distribution of the model in light of the data. Rather, they are drawing on a theory of importance sampling. So here, each particle is associated with a weight and represents potentially more or potentially fewer samples from the underlying population. So not all particles are the same. Some are highly weighted, meaning they have particular strength to that hypothesis, and some are weighted less, meaning the hypothesis is roughly speaking less likely. So here, each sample is represented by a particle, and at any one time, we can sample from those particles to sample from this state of the model. And we can compute statistics on sampled particles. For example, ask what is the mean number of individuals who are exposed across all hypotheses. And we can do it by sampling the particles according to their weight on an ongoing basis and computing the mean across those sample particles. So each particle is associated with a hypothesis about the world, a copy of the model state, values for state variables, and it's associated with a weight. Okay, and this weight represents sort of the level of representation, or how many particular samples this represents. It represents the level of strength of that hypothesis, as it were. And as I noted, particles reproduce and survive or perish, or reproduce or not, according to the quality of the match of the empirical observations. And we typically have a fixed number of particles. So we might have 1,000 particles, for example, that are maintained, or 10,000 particles. So each of these would be associated with a particle. And we might have some parameters which are additionally associated with model state. They evolve dynamically over time, say according to a random walk. Okay, so conceptually, and this is very important for implementation, a focus of another lecture, but for those interested in it, conceptually, for much of the particle filtering, except at a few key points, namely points of observation, we conceptually have the same model running at multiple layers, where each layer is associated with a different particle. So we could think of the whole model as occurring in sort of three-dimensional layers. Each layer is associated with a particle, has a different hypothesis about the current situation. And they each run independently between observations. And it's only when an observation is made that we need to reason for the condensation algorithm about all of the different layers. The way in which we capture this within practical models, this layering, is via subscripting. We subscript the model by particle, and then those particles each evolve in their own layer until an observation occurs. Okay. So between observations, particles just evolve according to the standard model dynamics. We just are running this model with particular values for each of these state variables associated with that particle, and we run it until the next observation point. The weights of the particles remain invariant using the scheme that we use, the scheme associated with of a condensation algorithm. And there's no filtering out of particles. All particles that start after the last observation continue till just before the next observation. They continue through that layer, continues through there. That's between observations. Very familiar. We're basically running the model 10,000 with 10,000 different layers of the model at the same time, running it forward to the between those two observations, from just after the processes that had to happen in the last observation till the next observation. They're all kind of running in parallel. Now, at the observation point, ladies and gentlemen, at the observation point, particle weights are updated, and they're updated to reflect the likelihood of observing any new data that comes in for that observation. Maybe it's one piece of data, it's many pieces of data. But we basically, we're going to upweight particles, give extra emphasis, extra credence, extra significance to, or extra credibility associated with particles that are very consistent with the new pieces of data, and will downweight or downplay, will minimize the significance of particles that are not consistent with the data. So this is going to reflect the fact that the particles associated with hypotheses that are consistent with the data are viewed as more credible and therefore more highly represented amongst the hypotheses. Now, if there is too much disparity in the weights seen amongst particles, it's going to go through a process called resampling that we'll be coming to. But basically, there's going to be this weeding out process. Particles that have very, very low weights are likely to be weeded out so that we don't get a concentration of almost all the weights in just a few particles. And then the particles will all start again with the same weights. Okay, so between observations, each particle has its own full copy of model state. Each particle has a certain number of individuals it posits as being susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered, vaccinated, and for any changing parameters, it's going to have a positive value for that parameter, any stochastically changing parameters. Each particle runs the model forward until the next observation. It just, given the number, the values of each of these state variables that posited by that particle after the last observation, it will just run forward the equations for this model till the next observation. The particle weights remain invariant. There's no filtering point. But, and this is key, each particle is going to be affected not just by the equations typically of a deterministic model, but there's going to be stochastics associated with it. Particle filtering is not interesting when we have a purely dynamic model. If a model is, purely deterministic model. If we have a model that's purely deterministic, ladies and gentlemen, if we were to see particles that initially have the same value, they'll retain the same value from then on. There's no uncertainty in the hypotheses that come in here, and performing particle filtering is not going to be that interesting within this context. Particularly when we have this process called resampling coming in, where a given particle that has a high weight, particularly, is duplicated into many particles within the resampled situation. We're going to have many identical particles. And if we don't have stochastics, if we're dealing purely with deterministic situation, those particles that are duplicated from the same underlying particle will forever carry the same values. There's going to be no diversity in them. And that's not of interest to us. We're instead interested in a situation where there's some stochastics, there's some variability. For particle filtering to be meaningful, there really needs to be some process noise, as we'd say, associated with the model, some uncertainty about how it evolves over time. That gives us some reason for having latitude in how we interpret the world. We have to reflect the fact, ladies and gentlemen, as a matter of humility, that the model is not a perfect representation of the world. We need to build into the model a certain degree of accommodation for the fact that the processes in the world include elements that are not accounted for in our neat deterministic equations, that there's some uncertainties out there in the world. So we do need stochastics within the model. And what this leads to is originally identical particles, maybe particles from the start of the model or particles after resampling. They're going to start to diverge because of model stochastics and potentially because of distributions associated over some parameters that are affecting the model, particularly stochastic parameters specifically. Generally speaking, particle evolution is governed in the sorts of models we're dealing with here, these differential equation models, by what's called a stochastic differential equation. So it's a differential equation with some stochastic elements. But key, the weights remain unchanged for all of this. So we have these particles evolving. Maybe this transition is associated with some stochastics, or these are associated with stochastics, changes in contacts per week. And that leads to stochastic influences on the changes here. So even if two particles started the same after the last observation, they increasingly diverge because of stochastics. Okay, so here, we might have, yeah, okay. And we're going to go in and talk about how the dynamics change at observations. This has been purely dynamics between observations we've been talking about. In order to get into dynamics at observation, we have to introduce a probabilistic model. Within this context, there's a central role played by importance sampling, and particularly sequential importance sampling within the model. Within this talk, I'm not going to go into this in detail, except to note that this is a big motivation for carrying around these weights associated with the particles. Ladies and gentlemen, the idea here is that we'd like to sample from the distribution associated with model states, the joint distribution associated with model state, in light of the observations seen in model dynamics. But generally speaking, we don't have any way of directly sampling from that distribution. And it turns out that we can't use tried and true techniques that we've explored in other contexts with deterministic models, like Markov chain Monte Carlo techniques, to sample effectively from the states of all possible model outcomes. When we have a stochastic model, it has just too wide a set of a variety of different possible model outcomes. Stochastics can occur at any point along the way, and we cannot reasonably sample from the set of spaces of all possible stochastic outcomes. So if we want to sample from the distribution associated with model state in light of observed data, it turns out it's hard to do directly. But there's something we can do, and this harks back to the notion of importance sampling. With importance sampling, whether it's here or in many other areas, we have a distribution we can't sample from easily. We can't sample from directly. Instead, we take a distribution we can sample from, call it Q of X, and we can sample from that. In this case, it's going to be a distribution associated with just the evolution of the model stochastically. And then each of the samples that we get from that we sample from this proposal distribution, we'll upweight it or downweight it compared to its relative frequency of occurrence in the real distribution we want to sample versus this proposal distribution. The thing to be emphasized here is that we'd like to be able to sample, to draw values from this target distribution, this distribution here associated with the model state given data. And that's hard, but what we do have is the ability to figure out, for a given sample, X, we can figure out the probability P of X very readily. It's just hard to sample from it. That's our problem. We have trouble sampling from it, but we can evaluate P of X for a given X. So if we have that situation, we could sample from something we can do more readily, Q of X, and then we'll associate with a weight a given sample from Q of X. If that sample of X is highly represented in the target distribution, the thing we'd really like to sample from, but which is hard to do so, we'll give it a higher weight. Meaning, particularly if its likelihood of occurring in that target distribution is much higher than its likelihood of occurring in this proposal distribution, we'll give it a higher weight, representing the fact that this one sample from Q of X actually should be treated as very highly represented in a sample from P of X. By contrast, if there's something we get out of Q of X, for example, which is very rare in P of X, we'll give it a low weight because it's not likely to occur within our target distribution, or P of X. And the idea here is that we have these samples that kind of adjust for the relative frequency with which we see a given sample in the target distribution compared to the proposal distribution that we actually sampled from. And then, having these weighted samples, we can sample from them with a probability given by their weight. So again, we'd love to sample directly from the distribution. Just draw values from the distribution of hypotheses about the current situation in the model, given the data we've seen to this point. But that's hard. We don't have a way of easily sampling from that. So instead, we sample from something that's easy, and we associate weights which emphasize things that occur more frequently in the distribution we do want to sample from relative to their frequency of occurring in this easy to sample distribution, Q of X. And then we sample in turn from these weighted samples according to their weight. And it turns out that this basic method can provably be used to sample from P of X. Okay. So when we have a distribution that's hard to sample from, this provides us this idea of weighting samples from another distribution and then sampling from those weighted samples according purely to their weight. It provides us a way to sample from a distribution that's hard to sample from directly. And that's exactly what goes on in particle filtering. We're going to explain this more in a later talk, and particularly how this fits in with sequential importance sampling. But that's the basic idea of why we're carrying around weights. They are weighted samples because we're sampling from a Q of X, a proposal distribution that's different from the target distribution. And this will allow us to sample from that target distribution, which is the sort of distribution of hypotheses involving the situation in the world. Okay, so here we're going to have, at observations, model estimates of state are going to be corrected by empirical data. And this is key. Remember, we've run the model between observations. We've run the model just flat out with each particle evolving independently of the other particles. From after the last observation to just before this new observation, we just run this model independently. Each of the particles evolves according to the equations associated with this model, which include some deterministic and some stochastic elements. At the observations themselves, we're going to correct the model estimates of state by the new empirical data. So here we're going from a kind of prior to the posterior. The prior is sort of the estimate of model state before considering this new data, and the posterior is going to be the estimate of the model state after considering this empirical data. And because we can't easily draw a sample from the posterior distribution itself, basically we do this by updating the weight. We use this principle of sequential importance sampling, and we actually update the weight associated with the given particle. This update to the weight is done based on updating these weights of particles that pre-existed. And it's a reflection of sequential importance sampling and the recursive structure of the particle filter, as we'll see in the later talk. So to do this, we're going to need to draw a proposal distribution that's easy to sample. And the weight will be based on that, and the value of samples in the target distribution. Okay, so the basic idea here is that at each observation, we're going to update the weights to reflect this principle of importance sampling. And a key element of updating the weights is going to be the likelihood function. So given a posited state of the world, a hypothesis for what's going on in the world, which I denote as x sub t, with a superscript of I being the particle. If we posit a certain situation in the world, the question we're going to ask is, what's the likelihood that we'll observe the empirical data just presented to us? Maybe it's one element of empirical data, maybe it's all a vector of different pieces of empirical data, the number of attempted suicides, number of completed suicides, number of helpline calls. Given our posited situation out there in the world, as posited by this particle I at this current time t, what's the likelihood that we will have observed this collection of sort of occurrences in the world as indicated by the data? If it's very likely that we would have observed this, if it's a very plausible observation given what we posit in the world, the weight is going to be higher. By contrast, the weight is going to be higher. The numerator is going to be larger, and therefore we'll multiply the old weight by a larger value. By contrast, if what we observe from the world is very unlikely to occur under the current what we posit about the world, if g of y of t given x of t is very small, if it's very unlikely given, we posit a population that's all with very few suicidal people with suicidal ideation, and we observe a large number of attempts and so on, it's going to be very unlikely that we would see that situation given what we posit about the world for this particle. And as a result, g of t, the likelihood function, will be very small, and the numerator therefore will have something very small multiplied by it. The whole division, the whole quotient here will be small, and the weight will at time t, after time t, will become much smaller than it otherwise would have been if they were highly consistent. So in short, states of the model that are posited to occur by a particle that are consistent with the empirical data are upweighted. Things, hypotheses about the world that have poor consistency with the empirical data are downweighted. They're weighted lower. Okay. So when a new data point comes in, we update the weights associated with each particle to reflect how well it matches the state of the world, how consistent the state of the world is we posit with that particle with the empirical data. And it turns out there's many ways of doing this. A particularly simple strategy is what's known as the condensation algorithm. And basically what it involves here, and this is going to be the subject of a later talk, so I'm not going to go into this in detail. Time is running short. But here we update the last weight we had for the particle simply by multiplying it directly by the likelihood. So this whole complicated thing here, which is what we saw right here, this whole complicated thing all collapses down to just be g of y of t given x of t. So we take the likelihood of observing this empirical data given what we posit as occurring in the world, x sub t or I, where I is the current particle, and we multiply the weight by it. So if the likelihood is very small, the weight becomes smaller. W of t becomes smaller. If the likelihood is very high, W of t becomes larger. And so, again, things that are consistent are upweighted, things that are with the positive empirical state are upweighted, things that are inconsistent are downweighted. Now, the choice of the likelihood function is one that demands thought. And because of the time and because of the scope of this talk, I'm not going to go into this in great detail. But it bears noting that this likelihood function, which I call here P of the probability of observing y of t given the underlying state of the model, but in the previous slides more generally it was called G. This gives the likelihood of observing what we see from the world given the model state at the current time, observing what we see at the current time given the posited state. Choice of this is something that's very important within the model. For much of our work, we have followed work by Dorigati et al., actually in the MCMC context, but we've successfully used this across many case studies where we assume a negative binomial distribution. And that negative binomial distribution is associated with a dispersion parameter. And it turns out that as you increase the value of the dispersion parameter here from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8, each of these increases is keeping the mean constant. Okay, I'm just showing this what this distribution looks like, a negative binomial. So here the mean is 1,000, and this is with the dispersion parameter of 1. Same mean, but dispersion parameter of 2. Same mean, dispersion parameter of 4, 8, 16. You'll notice it's getting more concentrated around 1,000. Before, early on, you know, it stretched out here well above 3,000. And, you know, it had lots of mass still around 1,500. As you increase the value of the dispersion parameter, it becomes more and more tightly controlled. So by 64, you have almost nothing at 1,500, and 3,000 is out of the question. 128, you know, even more so. Bear in mind that choosing a likelihood function is important. We use negative binomial rather than binomial in a lot of cases because binomial likelihood function would posit zero probability that you observe an empirical count above the number posited by the model. And it turns out that risks all particles at some point having zero probability of predicting the observation. And this causes issues because then you have all particles having zero weight and you have no hypothesis that has any possibility of occurrence. All of them, if you're in a situation where all the particles posit it should be lower than the empirical datum, you can get in that difficult situation. It tends to occur rarely, but when it does occur, it's a big problem. And the negative binomial is more understanding. It accommodates the fact that we can have reports that are above what's expected in the model and below what's expected in the model. Now, and we may talk about that more in a later lecture. Okay, in addition to adjusting the weight, you'll notice till now we've been talking about adjusting the weight. Increasing the weight if we observe something that's consistent with what we posit about going on, that a particle posits as being the case right now in the world, or lowering the weight if we observe something that's very implausible given what's in the world. In other words, the likelihood function is small. The other thing which happens after that is, if there's too large a diversity of particle weights following the updating of weights, we perform what's called a resampling. And here, particles, we draw a new set of particles to consider from the set of particles till this point, where each particle, as always, is drawn proportional to its weight. Just like we do in importance sampling, we give things weights, and then if we want to draw from the distribution, we actually have to draw samples from it with a probability according to their weight. That's what happens in importance sampling. We have, you remember, with importance sampling, here, with importance sampling, we'd like to sample from this. We sample from instead from a proposal distribution. We give things a weight, and then we sample with a probability of getting each one according to the weight. And that's what we do, ladies and gentlemen, in resampling. If there's too large a diversity of particles, that's what was shown right here. If the effective sample size is too small, we resample from possible states of the model where we have weights equal to 1/n. Okay. Okay. So here we perform a resampling of the particles, and a given particle here is going to be replicated or is going to disappear with a probability associated with the weight. Okay, so in other words, if the weight is very small, it's quite likely that it won't be resampled at all. If the weight is very large, it may be duplicated many times because we're likely to draw it many times. We're sampling from these particles according to their weight, and thus things that have high weight will be sampled, will be quite likely to be sampled. Things that have low weight will be unlikely to be sampled. Following this, all of the resampled particles are assigned a weight of 1. Okay, they're assigned an equal. Actually, this says a weight of 1. It's actually 1/n, 1 over the number of particles. Okay, so I should actually correct that. They're assigned an equal weight. It's they all have a uniform weight. Okay. Okay. So here with the resampling step, this is undertaken on an episodic basis based on the effective sample size. And fundamentally, if almost all the weight is concentrated in just a few particles, we want to have a diversity of particles. We want to use the full set of particles to better effect to represent a diversity of hypotheses, instead of concentrating just a few which are plausible and all the rest totally implausible. We want to have a large set of plausible hypotheses. And to make use of that, we perform resampling. We can then perform statistics over model quantities, and we can do so by sampling from the particles and performing those statistics over them. So if we want to take, we want to look at the mean number of infected people in the population as estimated by the particle filtering, we draw samples with the probability of drawing each sample proportional to their weight, and we take the mean over those samples we've drawn. Alternatively, we may wish to run the model forward and see the evolution of those particles, in which case we could just treat the particles as running forward. But if we want to sample from the distribution of the future outcomes of the model, we will need to sample from them according to their weight. Okay. Now the dangers, so there are issues that come up with particle filtering. There are challenges. One is if we have too few particles in place. We may not have enough particles to fully capture the distribution well. We have typically found between 1,000 and 10,000 to be useful. to be adequate, but there may be situations where many more are needed. For example, if you have a very large state space that you're trying to explore, such as with agent-based models. Another thing that can happen is particle impoverishment. Here, the particles basically become, the distinct particles can become too small in number, or condensation algorithm is too naive. So if new data is received very, very frequently compared to how quickly the growth is in model-related uncertainty, it may be inefficient to use the condensation algorithm. I may talk about that in a future talk. Broadly speaking, we have sought to evaluate particle filtering two ways. Particle filtered models. One is to use synthetic ground truth. So we actually have empirical data that's generated from a much more complex agent-based model, for example, where we know the precise situation, and we assess the degree to which adding particle filtering to a dynamic model improves the ability to estimate that underlying state of the system that was used to generate the empirical data, the state of the agent-based model. So here, we know what the true situation is in the world. We compare the ability to estimate that state in a dynamic model with particle filtering, a dynamic model with particle filtering. And the way in which we do it is comparing the model, and model prediction for the particle filtered model or the unassisted model against the underlying situation. And many other contributions, what we've done is we've evaluated the effectiveness of the particle filtering in terms of its ability to predict future reported cases. This is one particular example of it, but the idea here is that we take sort of the expected value of the mean squared error. So this is the square root of the sum of the squares of the differences across all times associated with differences between what we expect from the particle, from the simulated system and the observed report. So we consider only data to a certain time, t current, and after that we're computing discrepancies between what the particle filter, what the model going forward anticipates versus what's actually observed. And suffice it to say, this is not a case study presentation, but suffice it to say that particle filtering, in terms of error metrics, in terms of this this evaluation, it has demonstrated a degree of accuracy when you combine a simulation model with particle filtering that is far beyond what we see with traditional calibration, far beyond what we see with calibration methods. And you could see here, this is a log scale on the y-axis, and we're comparing error with particle filtering shown in red with error with calibration for the same model, same data. So calibrating a model against a given set of data versus particle filtering against that data, if that data is data over time, you typically gain in a huge way from particle filtering in terms of accuracy. Okay, so a few points of learning. Particle filtering is powerful methodology. It's a general methodology. It's much more so than Kalman filtering, which depends on very stiff distributional assumptions that depends on linearizability of the system. Particle filtering is a very general, powerful technique. It's often far more effective than calibration because we're regrounding the latent state, the current state of the model, not merely regrounding estimates of parameter values. A particle filter does need to balance between having too little confidence in model predictions and too much confidence in model predictions. With too little confidence, it's going to be so uncertain about the situation that if you only consider data to this point and you look forward even just a little bit, it'll be totally uncertain. If you have too much confidence in model predictions, that is too much too little stochastics associated with the model evolution, you tend to have the model be overconfident about its understanding of the situation. It'll discount the significance of data that it observes from the world, and it will not be learning as effectively from these observations in the world. So too little confidence is associated with stochastics that are too big in the model frequently, or likelihood functions that are too diffuse, too broad. Too much confidence is associated with likelihood functions that are too tight, and model stochastics that are too small. Here, tuning probabilistic model parameters makes a big difference for the accuracy of the model filter, particularly parameters associated with stochastics in the model. And if the likelihood is just too diffuse, particle filter often won't help all that much from my observation. Right, so I had noted particle filtering can compare very favorably to calibration. And it seems to be highly robust to a wide variety of assumptions. But its accuracy does depend on sort of these general parameters that are used within the particle filtering area. So thinking about the evolution of this work, our work is focusing on several different angles. One is leveraging particle filtering with elements of big data, elements of data from social media, from smartphones, from things like helpline calls, Twitter data, from searches, etc. Second of all, we've been exploring the dependence of these results on a wide variety of factors, including things like the sampling rate, the random walk parameter, etc. Exploring alternative mechanisms for than the condensation algorithm, and the degree to which these parameter choices for things involving the stochastic generalize to other conditions. Particle MCMC, ladies and gentlemen, is a more powerful technique yet that can estimate not only the joint latent state of the model, but also jointly values associated with parameters. And it is a particularly powerful technique for allowing us to infer aspects of the model, namely latent state and parameters from empirical data. It's my own conviction that that particle filtering as a methodology works particularly well with aspects of big data, high velocity data, with the big data grounding the models and supporting hypothesizing with the models. But the models taking advantage of the high velocity features of big data, the fact that we often have data coming in on a very frequent basis compared to traditional data sources, to where the particle filter model gives us a sense of the current situation in the system, what's going on in the underlying system that's giving rise to this data. It allows us to project forward where the situation might go, and to ask about the impacts of possible interventions. Particle filtering can further be used to determine adaptive sampling rates where we use to sample the system, how frequently we need to measure certain things. But at a broad level, it's often a consumer of the high velocity data in a way that takes that data and often disparate components of that data, different data sources, and weaves them together into an understanding of the whole system that's giving rise to them. Weave them together into an understanding of the current state of the system and its implications for change over time in the trade-offs between our choices. Okay, a few general conclusions here. Particle filtering can take many lines of evidence, giving and provide a portrait of the underlying system, the whole elephant, as I called it earlier, the underlying system that gives rise to them and how it's likely to evolve. Particle filtering continually regrounds model state, given evidence from the latest data, and it does so in a quite automated way. It doesn't require us to manually recalibrate the entire model to this data. Particle filtering is well suited to work with public health data streams and models, particularly aggregate models right now, although we've done some exciting work applying it to agent-based models. In the presence of these aggregated models, particle filtering we have found to perform well across many case studies. Application of particle filtering is not totally a turn the crank process. It does involve iteration, learning, experimenting with values associated with the stochastics, with aspects of the likelihood function, with the particulars of the data that you're including. Research progress, I believe, is keenly needed to support software, to provide software support for particle filtering, particularly for agent-based and discrete event simulation models, and even to make it easier in the context of aggregate models, and finally to help support particle MCMC within these domains. Okay, so that's the talk for this morning. I've got to get home quickly now, but as I'm finishing up, any questions or comments from you two? I think I'm